With me now in Washington, D.C. is Middle East policy analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Janatan Sayeh. Jonathan, great to see you.
Hi, great to be with you.
First of all, Keir Starmer, I put to Steve Witkoff there, Keir Starmer was urging the president to come to the table, negotiate a deal with the Islamist regime, and Witkoff's reply there was, well, we tried that. We tried it already. We spent months trying to thrash out a deal and it didn't come to anything.
Well, more like years. So any negotiation between Tehran and Washington really dates back to the 90s. We've never really been able to obtain any meaningful concessions from the regime. It has turned into this perpetual cycle where we really have an outreach diplomatically. On the other hand, they pedal back. They don't really scale back their enrichment programs. Plus, any deal with them needs to be more comprehensive than just the nuclear program. And so far, we've seen no appetite from the regime in Tehran, which is why this campaign is inherently legitimate, because we exhausted all diplomatic options with the regime, no matter what administration was in charge. So under Biden, you had really someone in D.C. that was providing very lax sanctions enforcement. He was appeasing the Islamic Republic. And compare that to the maximum pressure campaign, the regime's behavior did not change, which is why we arrived at this point.
So was our Prime Minister Keir Starmer then, was he just a bit naive or inexperienced or what in taking to the podium last week in Great Britain and posturing and calling for some peaceful negotiations? Why would he do that?
Any expectation to get behavior change from the regime, or any thought that you can somehow get the Islamists in Tehran to provide meaningful concessions or to really negotiate in good faith, yes, it is inherently naive, I would say, unfortunately, in that context. Now, looking at his administration under Starmer, what he could have done better with the regime in Tehran, yet to still designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror group. So again, that's a policy of appeasement. It was not even that bad under Biden, what we see under Starmer. In addition to that, again, I don't know how the Supreme Leader son has been able to develop such an extensive network across the United Kingdom. And again, once these threats are addressed, then we can talk about maybe other avenues.
So you're referring to there the £50 million property portfolio of the Ayatollah's son, who is now the Supreme Leader. One of his apartments, it overlooks the Israeli embassy. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's some sort of detail out of some dark comedy or something. Why has that happened? And why is Keir Starmer, why is this Labour government, and indeed previous governments, the Conservatives, why haven't they prescribed the IRGC? America did it in 2019.
Well, the European Union did it as well, but still we have not seen anything from the United Kingdom. I have to assume it is something to do with maybe backlash, but again, if you have fears of backlash
from who?
From the Islamic Republic. But that said, even without prescribing them as a terror group, you still see an extensive network from them of not only just gangs and criminal network across Europe, but they also increasingly have this Islamist network through different Islamic center mosques that they, of course, preach anti-Semitism, anti-British values, very just aggressive ideologies throughout. So even without any firm stance from the United Kingdom, we still see them really max out their malign activities. So you have to respond at some point. So what we've seen so far is that the regime does respond a bit better to a strong leadership more so than weakness. They do exploit it a lot more. So, I mean, if I'm sitting there in Tehran and I see that I can run this kleptocratic campaign across the United Kingdom, I'm not getting prescribed for it. What's stopping me? What's my incentive to halt these activities?
Yeah, we had an expert on last night in Middle East affairs who was saying that, maybe you can attest to this, that London is the home of the IRGC's crypto money laundering operation. Apparently, lots of the funds go through London. It's washed through certain cryptocurrencies and then back out all across the globe to fund the proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and so on and so on.
It certainly is, because, of course, London is an economic hub, and you have to pair that level of opportunity with lax sanctions enforcement, and that creates a safe haven for terror financing, and the Islamic Republic has been excellent at exploiting that, unfortunately.
I know J.D. Vance, the Vice President, joked a few years ago that, I don't know if you saw this, but he said the UK would be the first Islamist nation to get hold of a nuclear weapon. I know it was just in jest then, but I mean, I argue maybe a bit trivial. I argue that becomes truer day by day. Jonathan, thank you very much. Hang tight there. Mally Smith is down the line. Mally, when you hear that kind of detail, that London is the home of the IRGC's money laundering operation, the new Ayatollah, the son of the deceased Ayatollah, has a £50 million property portfolio, we've not prescribed the IRGC. What's going on there? What's that about?
I mean, Ben, I think smarter people than me would need to really delve deep into that. I don't really understand that. I feel like the UK should designate them a terrorist group, and I certainly don't think the Ayatollah's son, now the Ayatollah, should have $15 million apartments overlooking the Israeli embassy, as you said. So hopefully the UK government can take some corrective action there.
Yeah, indeed. Can I ask you, Mali, as a man of the left, I hope you don't mind me describing you of that, a man of the left of the argument, do you think the Iranians support this war? And maybe I'll ask Jonathan that in a second as well. Do you think the Iranian people, not the regime, because there's a distinct difference, but do you believe they want this war, this intervention?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think there's certainly segments and large segments of the population that certainly want to be free of the regime. I think the issue we have is that there are segments that are still support the regime, and the regime itself is really the only armed military faction within the country. So it's very difficult for them to overcome the regime by themselves. My worry about this war has to do more with, I don't think the U.S. can facilitate regime change through airstrikes alone. And I don't necessarily think, even if we committed ground troops and did a full-scale invasion like we did with Iraq, that if we necessarily instituted a regime change with troops on the ground, that we wouldn't have either sectarian violence break out, or once we left, like we saw with the Taliban in Afghanistan, that the armed forces of the Islamic Republic would take control again. But it's really sad, Ben, because clearly there's obviously people within Iran who don't want this government. There just unfortunately aren't the people with the guns.
Yeah, indeed. Right, Mali, hang tight, don't go anywhere. Jonathan, you're still here with me now. My question, same to you to Mali. Do the Iranian people want this? Because there is this growing argument that I've been on the receiving end of in recent days that, yes, they protested, the Iranian people. Yes, they gave their lives. Yes, they called for help from President Trump. But they didn't want this. They didn't want bombs falling on their head and oil rain and their sewers filled with oil and so on. Do they still support what's going on? Of
course they do. This is not to say the average Iranian wants regime change at any cost. Of course, we do not want to see major casualties going about in Iran. But that has not been this campaign. This has been a targeted wave of strikes against regime officials and the repression apparatus. You're talking about people that have brutalized the Iranians for half a century now. So any notion that we can somehow get rid of these guys through peaceful protests or elections or reform is just not realistic.
Yeah.
Having been on the ground myself, when you see them open fire on you, when you plead for help back in 2009, like we did under Obama, we got nothing in return, and the crackdown continued. Iranians are aligned that you need to use military force to remove this regime, and hopefully, once we capitalize on the nationalist and of course, Western and anti-Islamist wave across Iran, we'd be able to install a government that's not only in favor of the West, but in addition to that is going to be representative of Iranian national interests.
You say it's targeted strikes, but of course there were 160 odd babies, children, teachers killed in that airstrike. It's still being investigated. It was on a IRGC naval base next door to a school. The first argument is, why are you having IRGC naval bases next to a school, similar to what Hamas do with their hospitals? However, whoever is responsible for that, it's not a good look, is it? It's not a good PR look for selling the war.
By no means it is, and I think, you have, of course, assuming it's even confirmed true, again, no real videos and information has really surfaced from that. You would think a regime like that of Tehran's would just not hesitate to put out information, photos of these people that were allegedly killed. We've seen nothing of that sort. You know what we have seen? Them set up bases in schools, increasingly using civilian infrastructure as a security base to really shelter themselves, as you pointed out, just like Hamas. But I would end it with this one key point. It comes down to this. When you talk to an average Iranian on the ground, as I do every day, the idea is that we can rebuild infrastructure. We can re-establish different institutions. What we cannot do is revive the tens of thousands of young Iranians that were killed within 48 hours.
Yeah, indeed. And I always say they gave their lives. I argue, look, I'm not Iranian. I haven't been on the ground, but I've spoken to lots of Iranian people, particularly those who support the return of Reza Pahlavi, and they say those protesters went out en masse and they knew they were risking their lives to save the future of their nation, their children, their grandchildren. So, Jonathan Liss, if you're watching, that one's for you. Jonathan, thank you very much.